somebody down there put my slides back up, please? From earlier? It was so well received, I'm going to give my talk again. And if we can just go down, just slide down there, right after the question mark there, the blue, yes, please. All right, thanks. So I'm going to make this a little shorter just to try and catch us up a little bit, but we were talking about consumers and how they can get information, and workers, how they could get information. Tene mentioned a good guide, and she mentioned Skin Deep. So there are a variety of kind of sources out there that folks can start to use to figure this out. We're going to have a panel later where I'm sure they're going to talk a little bit about the difficulties that face professionals and companies in figuring out information. I just wanted to show you a couple of resources that are available for consumers, and we'll say a little bit about what's good, what's problematic about them, just to give us a sense of this. So one that's really well known, pardon the poor quality of my screenshot here, is the Good Guide. Nonprofit created a system for essentially rating various products. You can see here everything from personal care, food, household, so on. 75,000 products that are rated. This is an online. This is online. So if you have a product that you're interested in, you can look at it and see how they scored it and ranked it. You can also use it. It has a search function. You can set filters and identify what's important to you. So, for example, hasn't been tested on animals. It'll bring up what you need, right? So kind of like a Consumer Reports for the toxicologically inclined, right? And, like most things, in order to give people tractable information that can be used, it rolls up an awful lot behind the scenes. So this gives you just a very simple schematic about how they rate things, which is basically a color-coded and numerical system, which is self-explanatory, and then a sense of the types of issues that they take into account. So they're looking at ingredients, and then for each ingredient or the ingredients in general, they'll have a degree of concern drawn from several different kinds of criteria, right? So it includes toxicological concerns, but also other concerns are kind of wrapped up in that, and then you end up with your Good Guide rating. Now this is available, you can do this at home, but what about the person that's out at the store? So there was a survey of 1,000 moms a few years ago where they asked them, when you're out shopping, or when you're also home, do you research the safety of the products that you're buying for your family? And the response was 75% of folks try to do that. Moms try to do that. I don't know about dads, but moms tried to do it. But they found difficulty in getting tractable, salient information. So on the go, there are a couple apps that are available that you can download. Good Guide is now also available, so you can go to the store and you can read the barcode of the product, and it gives you information. Also, Environmental Working Group has Healthy Living. There's a variety of these on the marketplace. So I thought we'd just take a quick peek at them, if that's okay with everyone. Well, I'm going to do it anyway, whether it's okay with you or not. Let's see if this works. There we go. We're running the auto setup right now. And there we are. You're now looking at my phone. I'm going to put that here. Oh, yeah, I need a microphone. I'm not going to break anything. All right, so this is what you see when you, I'll use this one. This is what you see when you open up the Good Guide search, and you can open up your barcode there, and it allows you to scan some things. So I brought a few things along. I'm sorry. I brought a few things along. So I brought 3 different types of shampoos just to do a little. These I bought. This one last night I snuck into my daughter's room and took. She's going to be here later. Please don't say anything about the hair. All right, so let's take a peek. So this is Avalon Organic. So we talked about in the intuitive toxicology, and Bernie also talked about this notion of we call it organic or natural. How good is it really? So I'm going to pick up the phone right now. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I'll. Okay, so according to Good Guide, Avalon Can you see that? Oh, I'm glad I cut my nails. Avalon gets a 3. It's poor. Now, if you want to know why it's got a poor, you press that button, and then hopefully you slide down and you can get the details here, right? So there is an ingredient hazard. Other negative aspects they did all right on. And here's an interesting part about Good Guide. It also takes into account the quality and the availability of the data, right? And what's interesting about this is you don't get extra points. You can't score that well if you're missing data because it puts a cap on what your score can be, which is an important function if you take seriously this notion that lack of evidence is not evidence of safety, right? So here's one benefit of using Good Guide. So now let's take a look at, let's see how my daughter's doing. We'll scan this one. Much better. So Avino gets a 6. That's doing well. She's good. And it looks like, wow, they would have done even better had there been adequate data here, right? So for ingredient hazards, that's a 10. That's the best you can do. For other negative, these other negative things are if there's a chemical on there, we don't have particular data about that ingredient, but for some reason it's either banned somewhere, there's questions about it, there's some controversy, right? So these are things other than the technical data that's available. But as I said, there's a cap on it because the data quality is not there. So even though it could have scored higher, it doesn't. Now let's take a look at the most expensive one I got. This is Redken 5th Avenue, NYC. Let's see how it does. Uh-oh. I'm shocked to find out that it got a 0. And if we head down here, we see that it had other negative aspects. I believe the reason for that was that it had a regulatory ban on one of the ingredients, right? Okay, now let me say a couple things about these, okay? Is somebody using this shampoo? We're trying to figure out what ingredient it is. Oh, well, let's slide down. It would be the brown ingredient. I'm not sure we can see the fragrance. Okay? See how the whole conference is like, it's like we've tied everything together. That was all planned. Okay, so they got a 0. Now this is on Good Guide. Let me say just a couple words about some things to be cautious about here. Before I had talked about this notion that decisions about safety are trade-offs, right? You're going to be making trade-offs. So they're looking at when you look at the methodology for Good Guide, and it's very, the methodology is laid out at great length, and I think that's a real positive. But the actual methodology, that is, what was the score given to individual ingredients, and more importantly, what was the weight put on one kind of ingredient, one kind of concern versus another, is very important, right? Because while I may be most concerned about neurotoxicological effects, someone else may be more worried about reproductive effects, right? But you can't tell that when you look at this, and you can't set your own weightings, right? So you have to be cautious about this because you're essentially adopting the trade-offs developed by others of which you do not know, okay? Here's one other issue. We've got a lot of these apps that are out there. Let's see how this one does on the environmental working group, Healthy Living, okay, which is, I think, a much more attractive interface. Let's see how it does. Okay, we'll scan. A 6, right? Limited, but compare a 6 to a 0. Now here's the thing. You may look at that and you say, wow, what's going on with environmental working group, right? They're not as safe or they're not as useful. But remember, we don't actually know how Good Guide came up with that particular set. We know it was because of a regulatory ban. But when you're out shopping, when folks are using these, the demonstration here that I really wanted to make was, you're going to have a range of outcomes, and why they came out that way is often buried in layers that we don't have access to. It sounds an awful lot like government regulation, right? So we need to keep that in mind, right? Now, if you're worried that, I just ginned the system up by picking this one, for that reason, because it had two different results. You're right. That's exactly what I did. Because how interesting would it be if it had the same result? Am I right? Okay. Thank you for your attention. These will be on sale out in the lobby later on.
Okay, can we get our panelists back up? Where are you going, man?
I'm not really on this now.
Really? No. Come on. Tim, you need to be, because I have some questions that involve you.
But I'm going to be...
Okay.
Depending on where you guys sit.
down at the end.
Table tennis. Spicy.
You set me right up there with the good guy.
You don't get one. Okay, so we heard a lot of reasons to think that we need to do a better job of getting information out to the public, and also perhaps talking to people about how to process that information once we get it out to them. I'm going to ask you guys your opinions in terms of, is there something, so every time I hear labeling, Tim and I have this conversation probably like every 6 months. We talk about labeling and we come back to what are people gonna do with that information, right? So what are your thoughts in terms of, are there things that we sort of holistically as a community could be doing better at the starting point, like before we get to the discussion of the individual products, to really be talking about things like risk maybe in, I don't know, elementary school, or when is the appropriate time to start those conversations? Silence.
Well, you kind of went like I think we all thought you were going one direction, and then
and I
yeah.
I guess I'll try to tackle that one. The appropriate time, I think, as early as possible. I think there are certain times when people start looking more at ingredients. I think when women are pregnant, or folks have certain health issues and they start looking more at ingredients. But I think we should be having that conversation way earlier. I think we've set up our system where we put all these chemicals out, and then when someone has, when we start to get information that they're hurting people, we start to take them back, and then we add another chemical that does the same thing, we take it back, and really starting to think about how we can sort of address this, a precautionary principle, address this before it starts to get out there, but we're so far out there already, I don't know.
Yep.
I'll add a little bit. So my background is in chemistry, and I made it to grad school before really even thinking about, we had lab safety, but the lab was one thing, and then the life you lived was totally separate. And we didn't, even though many of my graduate school cohorts go on to work for industry, designing products, designing chemicals for products, this was not something that was covered at any point in the undergraduate curriculum. And that's ridiculous. Chemistry is one obvious place where it could be included in high school even. I don't think that would be too soon for some kind of introductory opportunity for learning, which could get people engaged at a younger age and make this less scary, hopefully.
So this actually, for me, gets into the area of risk communication. So when you are trying to use labeling as a mode of gaining informed consent, I would say, first of all, there's a large body of literature that looks at all the ways that required labels subvert that intent, right? So just think of any pharmaceutical you've ever seen in the product information packet inside. Do you really think that's intended to gain informed consent? Absolutely not. In fact, it's almost certainly aimed to obfuscate that. So I think Baruch Fischoff has done a lot of work on this. There's a really great handbook on risk communication that he produced for the FDA. It's downloadable online that goes through the principles, but I think it's really good at arguing that you have to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish. So and the labeling is the idea that you just say it. You just put information out there and you assume that's going to somehow do things. And there's a higher bar for if you're actually trying to change knowledge. And then there's an even higher bar, which is if you want to change behavior. And if you want to change behavior, then it is not enough to just do this top-down transmission of information that you think people ought to hear. You actually need to understand what people already think, what their interests are, how they're going to make sense of the information that you put out there. And so it's actually you can't do top-down development and have it in this kind of knowledge transmission sense and have it accomplish what you think you want it to accomplish. So I would say there needs to be more, we ought to be talking about that, about not just what are the right words to put on the label, what color do you make it, what difference does the color make in the judgment people make of it. There's been really good work done in Switzerland about the effects on labeling nanomaterials, because the nano industry was really anti-labeling as a way of dealing with it. So a bunch of experimental research, and we know labeling something immediately communicates to the public, especially a public that doesn't know much about it, that there's something they ought to be worried about. And so it is a good way of producing a certain amount of amplification, which is exactly why the industry did not want it used. So I think there are a lot of complicated issues in there. And so like when you're talking about hair, about people wanting to know, one of the things you find is that a lot of people don't want to know, especially people like farm workers, like the workers. Risk attenuation is a necessary part of your livelihood. And so that's a whole different kind of issue on a moral basis and also practically in terms of how, but building coalitions, which is what you are doing, seems like the right way forward to me to address that.
Tim, no thoughts? Okay.
I have thoughts, but I would rather hear our panelists.
Patrick asked me to remind people, if you're either completely online or you're online but with us, that you can pose questions from that Slido website, which is www.sli.do, and our code is TOX, T-O-X. Speaking of which, do you have questions for the panel? Okay.
It's not a question, it's actually a comment. About, I believe it was for you, Barbara. Someone said, I'm interested in toxins in the food supply, but then he talks about being concerned about GMOs and hormones in the feed. So do you, I guess what I would use this as a platform for is, do you think that there's a little bit of sometimes confusion between different sort of elements of safety that makes the message not clear for the general public? And how do people deal with this?
I'm supposed to reiterate it. Essentially, is the information out and in circulation to the general public about something like GM food? Is it too complicated? Is it unclear to people? And what are the effects of that?
Actually, that was more of a comment. The person said, my particular concern is with GMO foods and the use of hormones in the feed. And what I take this into in the direction of is, we were talking about toxics, now people come up with concerns about hormones and GMOs, and to me, that means there's a kind of a confusion of concepts here. So how do we transfer clear information to the public about different kinds of risks?
again, my reaction as an anthropologist is that you don't assume you already understand what the right concepts are for that, to address that person's issues and concerns. And so I would want to talk with them and try to understand what their ideas about toxics, their mental models for toxicity, and therefore where there are divergences with expert knowledge that could be useful for them.
So Barbara, I'm not at all disagreeing with you. I mean, I completely agree with you in principle, but I'm just wondering, how do we translate that into education that reaches, or conversation even, that reaches a broader audience, right? That if it really is about having those conversations, how do we create the circumstances where we have those conversations with the broader publics that we're trying to reach? Oh, Tim wants to.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just I wanted to reframe the notion of who's doing the communicating and who's processing the communicating. Because there's this great project, now I'm forgetting where they're doing it, I think it's called the Disclosure Project, where they did a lot of studies on various disclosure regimes, voluntary and mandatory. And, think about your normal day, how much information comes at you, right? Just the volume of information you have to process. And then, like, your question about when do we start teaching children about toxics, and Avery, you'd said, oh, I got the toxics. I mean, the notion that we're going to create a society of kind of quasi-toxicologists, I think is just, that's not what we should be thinking about, I think. Okay. I think what we should be kind of teaching or trying to empower is critical thought and decision-making skills, because most information that's out there goes through intermediaries. Right, so like we think about labeling products and saying, well, how would the consumer know what that means? And to a certain extent, the labeling on the product is also meant to be available to the good guide people and to the toxicologists and to the, the EDFs of the world, and then they can process it, and then it becomes available. And if the folks who are receiving that information have learned how to, it's kind of really important these days, right, to kind of look at find trusted sources, critically analyze it, and then be able to kind of be able to make decisions. And so teaching, just to go back to your last question, teaching at even, kindergarten up through middle school into the ability, which is a transferable ability, it's not limited to toxics. So I guess I would say kind of supporting and enabling those who serve create the information, enable and support those who serve the intermediary function, and focus on broad critical analysis and decision-making skills. That would be kind of like the hat trick, I think, for doing this.
I could kind of piggybacking off that, it's like knowing your audience and who the messenger is. Even going out and talking to salon workers, and I have all this information, explaining it to a salon worker who then goes and explains it to other people. So how do you read a safety data sheet? How do you process all of this information? I think that is also a very important thing, is like who the audience is and also who the messenger is and how that information is told.
Barbara, did you want to?
So I also think there is a tension in this, in that we, especially in our society, are inclined to think that this should devolve onto individuals and that there should be individual choice about that, and we tend not to want to think about the way that devolves responsibility onto individuals as opposed to holding our society accountable in ways that we should be. So, and I think that's definitely what Tim is talking about. I don't think you're an anti-regulator.
No, I'm a big supporter.
So I think part of the discussion we have to have is how to have both, how to have an informed citizenry and have that information in utterly digestible, usable sound bites, but also how do we have societal public participation in decision-making at the societal level that's that's critical for those individuals who can't engage in self-protection. So that's the farm worker case. It could be so on, more people who have to take that job because farm workers would say to me, well, if I don't work, I die. This is not an individual choice issue. At that point, you need policy, but you also need the will to implement that policy, and that is a moral responsibility, I think, that we all have. But we need that, so I would say we also need to teach that moral responsibility.
Martha?
So there's there's this assumption that somebody's minding the store, that somebody's looking out for us, right? When it comes to the consumer products that we buy. And then when you deal with communities like farm worker communities, you deal with issues about power and access to power, and the power to actually change the situation and change our farming structure, right? So, and then, I think that the work that Black Women for Wellness has done actually laid bare a lot of the challenges with how we do our work, right? When the products that we use, that women of color use, weren't in the database, this assumption that, well, then don't use them, right? And I mean, I work in this field, and you get that, like, you show up at a meeting wearing makeup, and you get side-eye, right? So, but that may not be your choice. So I think that it gets a lot more complicated in terms of how you educate individuals, and part of educating them is nobody's minding the store, so you need to look out. And then there's this is all based on consumers, right? And you get to choose what you buy, and then we're locked into certain markets depending on our social class. So then there's the exposures that we have no control over. That you can educate me all I want, but I can't move the refinery.
Are there other audience questions, Mike?
Well, a comment and question. So it seems to me when I look at the regrettable substitutions and a lot of the problems that are happening in chemical policy, they're very fundamental to what we see in a lot of arenas in public health, where the solution today's problem becomes the problem of tomorrow. And we see that, we used to think that living near factories was a bad thing, so we created urban sprawl. Now that underpins a lot of our major public health problems. If we look at chemicals policy, if you had to do one thing, what would that one thing be to avoid making today's solutions tomorrow's problems? And I'd like to open this up to our other speakers this morning, because I didn't get a chance to be very interested in Dr. Wilson's perspective.
And that might actually be a great question for the final panel when everybody's up here. No? I mean, I don't know. Do you want to? Shall we hold that and make that the first question we ask everybody at the panel?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So you got a lot to think about.
Yeah, Bernie, go ahead.
Well, Barbara made the very important point that the warning that we do get, mostly obfuscation, they're so long no one's going to read them. There's a whole literature on whether or not adding a label, as important as it is in terms of public communication, basically just turns people off because there's so much information in there. The Food and Drug Administration has traditionally held the view that you cannot put something on the label, they won't require it unless there's absolute scientific evidence that there's adverse effects, which would cut out a lot of information from labels. But they do have some strength to that. So how would you trade that off? How would you decide that additional warning for something that we're worried about, but there isn't quite enough scientific proof is worth it, because people ought to know about it, make their own decisions, versus, well, it's also, if there's something else on that label that's really important for people to pay attention to, they'll pay less attention to it because there's so much information. How do you do that? Barbara, I'm looking at you.
I know you're looking at me. I don't know. I mean, again, you know that body of literature as well, or better than I do. There is a lot of work being done on intervention with more effective, more public-oriented labeling for pharmaceuticals, and it can make it more comprehensible. But yes, the weighting of all those different factors and the degree to which those weights should shift across different circumstances is an extremely complicated multivariate analysis, really. And so it gets right back into the heart of this. Do we have the experts in multivariate analysis do the analysis and communicate the results? Do we create online tools where people can input their own variables? And, the way I use the UC's retirement program to calculate the optimal retirement benefits in time. There are tools like that are being used for a lot of different things. I think we have to get creative about it, really. But I don't think just straight out labeling. Right there you have the grocery industry, which is also trying to subvert. Every time I go into my grocery store, they've moved everything. They do not want us using the heuristics that we develop to shop efficiently for food. They want us to be barraged with all this additional information. So maybe the intervention has to be with the grocery industry. You put the high risk stuff down at ankle level, and you put the green stuff up at eye level. I think we have to think creatively.
And in a way, this really comes full circle. I agree completely with Martha's point, and in a way, we've artificially kind of segmented things even across the year, because COEH, we had the symposium in the fall that looked at things like the Aliso Canyon and talked about natural and man-made disasters like Exide, and right. So we're segmenting those things out, and now we're segmenting. Let's move regulation off and just look at what we can do without regulation. And I think the answer is this is a complex system, and you're going to have regulation, and there's going to be all sorts of things that are going to come into play, and we're being a little bit reductionist here, or a lot reductionist here. So with that in mind, I'll say, I think it comes back to what these guys said about information. So two kinds of myths or constraints I think we create for ourselves. We tend to, when we say information disclosure, ingredients disclosure, we tend to think about labels. And I think you made a great point that there's other ways to give people information than labels, and we should be creative about that. That's one thing. And the other thing is this notion of, like, it is true, there's a huge literature on being overwhelmed by the information, but there's also a lot of literature on, like what you said, about people don't want to know, or it's irrelevant because it can't change, so why look? So hazard communication, I think, is a great example of this. So when we're thinking about information disclosure broadly, we also have to think about who the audience is, how they can use it, what the constraint, and then, sometimes we're going to need regulation to force somebody to change because we know that the folks who are victims of it are not empowered. Other times, I think we have to be respectful of people's autonomy and not force information on them if they don't want it. And so there's all these things that we said, but I think kind of people will naturally break out. So when I think about labeling, if it's possible, or information disclosures, you can have a segment of people who really want that information and will use it. So my general feeling is it ought to be available for whoever wants it. So they should get it. How they get it, I think, has to depend on how to make it salient, how to make it effective and efficient, and those kind of things. Then there's going to be people who, just don't want it, or, don't. And I think, so we have to figure out ways that, match those trade-offs. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop. I wasn't even supposed to be on this panel, but I agree with you that there are tools to help people make decisions. Like, think about your Reader's Digest or Consumer's Report when you buy a toaster or washing machine. We need that for products where you can identify what's important to you, and it helps you deliberate. It doesn't make the decision for you, but it helps you deliberate. So anyway, that's it. I'm done. I'm not going to answer another question.
I was looking for Christine because I actually wondered, do you guys want to do lunch?
We should probably have lunch.
Yay! Okay. So please join me again in thanking all of the panel members. I have a note here that you're supposed to show the campus map and picnic spaces, which I think means that you're encouraging people to get outside the building.
What time should
Is that true? Christina? Oh, here she is. Okay, good. Okay.
I'm taking pictures.
So just out this door, you'll see a table with a variety of boxed lunch options, and it's a beautiful day outside. Get out and stretch your legs. We've got little maps of campus, if you're unfamiliar with it, where we indicated some spots we thought would be nice. Enjoy. Oh, and we will reconvene at... We'll see you back here at 1:15. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're gonna kick things off, and we're gonna get started. Get your blood going with another question. So you might check. I think the Poll Everywhere might log you out if it's been more than a half an hour. So you may have to text the number. No, you're saying no.
We tried it. It's fine.
Okay, we tried it and it's fine. So here, you know how to do this by now. Question is, name one. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, if get out your smartphone, get your messaging app out, and by the way, I should tell you that you know, if your plan charges for text, it may charge you. So just send your bill to Patrick, and he will reimburse you for your charges. So text to the address 22333, and then text the word toxics as the message. That will get you into the poll. You'll get a little message that says, you're in the poll. And then after you've gotten that, just in the subject matter, you don't have to, right? Just the message itself, please answer the question, name one company that you believe is making efforts to reduce or eliminate toxics. And if your company's got more than one word, if you want to keep them together, just string it, make it one word. Don't put a space in and they'll stay together. Okay? Nice. Oh, I didn't vote.
You keep pressing send.
Yeah. Let's see what we got. Well, I'm sure feeling good that Beauty Counter is getting so big because we have somebody from Beauty Counter here. I sent it 8 times. No, I didn't really. Very good. I mean, in a way, that's heartening, isn't it, to see so many companies that are up there? And it kind of leads us into our first session for this afternoon, businesses and tools to reduce exposures. And what we've got in store for you are 2 folks who have been kind of engaged in this from the very, very start of the move towards elimination of toxics at the company level, right? So our first speaker is a dear friend, Ann Blake, who I've known for quite some time. Oh, I don't want to, she has a line that she'll share with you about her background, but Ann is an independent consultant who works with both companies and NGOs and governments to assist them in making chemical assessment decisions. She's also a member of the Green Ribbon Science Panel in California, which is an advisory group that helps the Department of Toxic Substances Control implement their, really very revolutionary consumer products regulation. So Ann's going to kick us off with a discussion of safer chemicals and materials, making the business case for that. Ann?